Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Norris Pasek, and I have the honor of introducing Dave Zook, your host for this evening. I personally am involved with all of Dave's real estate investment opportunities as I handle investor relations and take care of the bookkeeping and cash flow distributions to all of the members. I know some of you from past syndications and opportunities, and I hope to get to learn more about you in the future. A little bit about Dave. He's a successful business owner and an experienced real estate investor. He is active in the multi-family space and the resort community development. He has syndicated over $20 million worth of real estate in his career. He, along with his development partners, are actively involved in the development of the largest real estate development in the island of Ambergris, Belize, which is rated the #1 island in the world by TripAdvisor. He and his wife, Susan, and their 4 children reside right here in Lancaster County, PA. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Dave Zook.
Thank you, Norris. That was some nice comments. I'm so glad you guys chose to come out and spend the evening with us. I love getting around other investors, entrepreneurs, and business owners. See some of my existing investors in the room. I appreciate you guys coming out. I know most of the people in the room, but just so I can see a little bit better, some of you guys I don't know. So by a raise of hands, who owns real estate or invests in real estate, has real estate in their portfolio? All right, most of us. Good. It would be interesting to hear hear all of your stories and what it is that brought you here, or where you're looking to get out of this evening. Maybe you're concerned about the long-term future of the U.S. dollar or the volatility in the stock market. We are going to touch on some of those things this evening. Some of you are probably wondering how a Lancaster County native got involved in real estate investments in Belize, and I'll share my story. I first met 9-year Belize resident and our keynote speaker for this evening, John Turley, on a Real Estate Guys Investor Summit at Sea, where we spent a week with 200 other investors and learned a lot about real estate investing with Robert Kiyosaki and his team, and a bunch of other interesting folks. John Turley was on board, and it didn't take him long to convince me to come down to Belize and see what he's up to. I've been there 5 or 6 times since. John is the managing broker and founder of RE/MAX Southwind LLP, and has been the #1 RE/MAX associate for all the Caribbean, Central America, and South America each of the last 4 years. Last year he was #1 RE/MAX associate in the world. There's 92,000 RE/MAX agents in the world. John is on top of his game. His success is in large part due to his being in the #1 up-and-coming tourist destinations in the hottest real estate markets in the Caribbean. John is the foremost expert on Belize real estate investing in his #1 market, Ambergris. In particular, John is the only American to serve on the board of directors of the Belize Real Estate Association, a position he has held continuously since 2010. He has been happily married for 21 years to his wife, Lucindia, along with 3 children, have lived full-time in Ambergris, Belize for the last 9 years. I can't think of anyone more qualified to talk to us about that market. And could you help me welcome John Turley?
Well, thank you very much, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I've told Dave that I will continue to keep coming to visit Lancaster County every time he'll invite me to dinner at Shady Maple. So that's our arrangement, and so far he's upheld it. So thanks, Dave. I'm going to just start by asking just a couple of quick questions of you, and I'd appreciate it if you don't raise your hand, then at least be honest in answering internally. But just by a show of hands, how many of you, when you think of the idea of investing in a foreign market, that there's just a little bit of trepidation, a little bit of hesitation, maybe a little fear or anxiety, kind of the fear of the unknown, when we think of investing in a foreign market? Just by a show of hands, who's just a little bit hesitant about that? I appreciate all the hands and the honesty with that. Now, how many of you when you thought, whether your hand went up or not, how many of you, when I said foreign market, immediately equated that with international? So quite a few hands, say most of the hands equated a foreign market with international. Well, here's the first thing I'd like to do is just to help to dispel that thought. A foreign market really is anything that we're not educated about. And so a foreign market could be Pittsburgh as a real estate investor. It could be Philadelphia. It could be any asset class. If we don't have the education, if we're not knowledgeable, if we haven't taken in the proper education and knowledge to be able to make a qualified, educated decision, then that would constitute a foreign market. So we often think of it in terms of geography, but the reality is that in a global economy, the difference in boundaries between cities and states and even nation states and countries is really inconsequential. If you don't view yourself as being an international investor, then just take a look at the Fortune 500 and see that 70 of the Fortune 500 companies have moved their headquarters offshore. And if you're a stock investor, if you invest in paper assets, then you're more of an international investor than you realize. And so with that notion, my goal and objective in sharing with you and educating you about the market of Ambergris Key Belize is to help to ensure that at the end of this evening, it's not a foreign market for any of you, that you'll have taken in the knowledge to understand enough about the market and the market dynamics so that it's no longer a foreign market. Now, I'm going to start the presentation with kind of a embarrassing story, if you will. It's really sharing the story of what brought me to Belize and how I moved there in the first place. I wish I could stand before you and tell you that I had a crystal ball and that 9 years ago I had the foresight to realize that this would be such an incredible market opportunity for investment in 2014. But the truth of the matter is that it was really a more personal decision that brought me to Belize in the first place. In February of 2005, my wife and I were living in Colorado, and I was very fortunate to have two very successful businesses, and I had a home office, and I got to work from home, which I thought was wonderful because I had more quality time with my family, or so I thought. But I had an epiphany one day. My son was walking by the open door of my home office, and as I looked at him, I did a double take, and I thought, my gosh, Trent is getting big. And I had to stop and think to myself, just how old is he? And I quickly added up in my head and realized that he's 8 years old. And the problem with that is I thought, man, he was just 5 just the other day. And where's the time gone? And it made me really stop and think that the time was passing, and I was so absorbed in working my business, providing for the family, that I really lost sight of the fact that there are no mulligans, there are no do-overs. And so from a quality of life perspective, I told my wife that I really wanted to change our direction and change where we were going. And please indulge me, because the reason I share this personal story will come to fruition, and you'll come to understand and appreciate probably about 15 minutes from now that there's a real-world application for all of us in this personal story that I'm sharing. So back in 2005, my wife and I, and this is a picture of the family here. So Lauren wasn't born yet. Lauren is just an infant here, our youngest, but my wife Lucinda, this is our son Trent and Christina. So before Lauren was born, my wife and I had this discussion, and we said, let's really look at ourselves and see what we can do and determine what our priorities in life are. And we said to ourselves, quality of life is the most important thing to us. We want to really have quality of life as a family, to have quality time together as husband and wife, as a family unit, as parents and children. And we only have one chance to raise our kids. We only have one chance to go through life together as a family. So we said, if we were to sit down, hypothetically, with a sheet of paper and to come up with a list of all the desirable qualities in a destination to move to, if we were going to move somewhere and start from scratch, just on the basis of quality of life, what would be the characteristics that we would be looking for? And my wife said, well, you really like to tackle the small assignments, don't you? And I said, honey, it's kind of like that old joke. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So we came up with a list, and this is what our list looked like. It was our wants, needs, desires, and requirements. And I apologize for some of you on this side here if it's difficult seeing the screen. But for my wife and I, English speaking was very important to us. I wish I could say that I'm fluent in foreign languages. I've tried learning foreign languages, and unfortunately it's just something I don't have a natural aptitude for. So I fall in the same category as 91% of Americans, in that I only speak English. Well, right off the bat, that eliminates most countries around the world. So as we're considering where we might move outside the United States, our list got very short very quickly. And then we wanted to be in close physical proximity to the United States. We didn't want to be too many time zones away or too many hours flight time away. That made our list even smaller. We wanted to be a place that was politically stable, had a good economy, beautiful climate. If you're going to move somewhere for quality of life, you'd like to choose a good climate. And so we went through our list of criteria, and as we went through and kind of added up the scorecard, we found that the country of Belize had more points, more characteristics, more qualities, more things going for it than anywhere else. And I'm not going to take the time out of respect for your time to go through each and every one of these line items, but again, this was a very personalized search. Because I'm a real estate investor, I was concerned about the legal system. It mattered a great deal to me that Belize was based on British common law versus Napoleonic civil law. That might not be on your radar if you're looking at investing or moving to a foreign country, but I wanted to make sure that I would have fee simple title if I own property. And Belize is the only country in Central America that's based on British common law, the same as in the United States. I also wanted to make sure that there was a secure and safe banking system. Belize happens to have the highest reserve requirements of any central bank in the world, and there's never been a bank failure in Belize. So in Belize, for every dollar that's in the banking system, the bank has to actually hold reserves. Kind of an unusual concept. In the US, we have the Federal Reserve, which is neither federal nor has reserves. And in Belize, every dollar that goes in the bank, 24 cents of that dollar has to be held in actual cash, actual reserves. So that's part of why there's never been a bank failure in the history of the country. And so for my family and I, as we went through this list, this helped us to determine that Belize looked as though it had the characteristics we were looking for. And within the country of Belize, specifically the island of Ambergris Key, which is the #1 tourism destination, and it also happens to be the #1 location for expatriation, for Americans looking to relocate or retire abroad within the country of Belize. So we moved there in 2005. We told ourselves that if we loved it, we'd probably stay for 2 years. If we didn't love it and we were wrong in our judgment or assessment, then we'd probably stay for a year, because you can make it a learning experience and get through anything for a year. And 9 years later, we can't imagine living anywhere else. It's really turned out to be exactly what we were looking for as far as quality of life. So hold that thought, but we're going to come full circle and you'll understand why I shared that personal story with you momentarily. So just to kind of set the table about the market, just a couple of beautiful photos here. The largest living barrier reef in the world is just a 1/4 mile offshore. We'll see some aerial photos so you have a little better feel for it. If we have any fishermen in the room, when we go fishing, this is what we use for bait. The fish are so big. And so I say that tongue-in-cheek, of course, but these grouper literally were caught 400 yards from the end of this dock. So when we go deep sea fishing, we go right outside the barrier reef, which is 400 yards from shore. So a 1/4 mile from the beach, this is the type of fish that we're catching. So it really is nice in the sense that you don't have a 45-minute boat ride or 45 miles to go. And because it's so sparsely populated and not overdeveloped, we catch this kind of, this was one morning going fishing from 7 to 9 before we went to work for the day. We caught 2 fish. We were planning to catch more, but we decided that as big as they were, that we'd stop at that. Now, this right here is interesting. This is a McDonald's, a Taco Bell, and a Starbucks side by side. And again, I say that tongue-in-cheek. There are no fast food brands or fast food restaurants or franchises in the country of Belize, which just kind of tells you where we are in terms of the stream of time and the stream of development. Now, with that in mind, let's make sure we know where Belize is located. There's the mainland component, and then there's the islands or the keys. Belize borders Guatemala and Mexico, and the largest of the islands or keys is Ambergris Key that you see circled here in red. Now, in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll notice it says 46% of Belize is either National Park or Marine Reserve. And that's an astounding figure. I've tried to find if there's any country in the world that has a larger percentage that's been set aside, dedicated for environmental and ecological protection, and I haven't found any country that has set aside nearly as much of its land as Belize. Just to put it in context, if everything east of the Mississippi River was made into a national park, that wouldn't be anywhere close to 46% of the United States. So that's a good thing. That's a very protective and forward-thinking decision on the government's part. Now we're going to zoom in and take a look at the island itself. So Ambergris Key is about 24 miles long, 3 miles wide at the widest. It's a world-class water sports destination. We've considered to be one of the top dive and snorkeling sites in the world. The spearfishing, the deep sea fishing, the saltwater flats fishing, parasailing, kite surfing, all the water sports really make it stand out as a world-class destination. The population is about 22,000 people, and of course you always want to know compared to what, and so just from a context of population density, there's 2 other islands in the Caribbean approximately the same size, and those are the the islands of Roatan, Honduras, and Grand Cayman in the Cayman Islands. Each of those islands are about 60,000 people, so about 3 times the population. So again, from a population density standpoint, that just gives us some context. Now, because we're talking about real estate investment, we're going to talk about a very unusual aspect of the market here. In the United States, for those of you who either currently own investment property or have owned investment property in the past, when we talk about residential investment property, we typically are talking about property that is leased on a year-round basis, and we collect our rents how often? How often is rent typically paid? Monthly. I heard monthly, and I think we would all agree that that's a very typical arrangement. Now in Belize, you could do exactly the same thing. If you had a house or a condo and you wanted to rent it out, there's a very strong long-term rental market, and there's a reason though that you probably wouldn't do that. And this is what it is. If you had a condo that you could rent for $1,500 or $2,000 a month, then you could certainly keep that income, but that same condo rented as a short-term nightly or weekly rental would receive about $400, pardon me, $400 a night. So there's a much, much stronger demand for transient or short-term rental inventory. And so we pay particular attention to the tourism numbers because that's where our demand is from a rental property perspective. So at the end of 2006, we had a room count of 670 rooms. That was our total number of hotel rooms, condos, villas, bed and breakfast, the aggregate gross number. Now some of those condos are owned by people who spend a few weeks or a few months a year, or might even live in them full time, or might be renting it out with the objective of moving and living in them in the future. So again, that's a gross number. It doesn't mean there's always 670 rooms available. But in the course of 6 years, from 2006 to the end of 2012, our room count tripled until we reached the number 2,000. Now 2,000 is a very important number within the tourism industry. That's when a market reaches critical mass. And we say that it reaches critical mass because there's 3 very important groups that start to pay attention to a tourism destination once there's 2,000 rooms. Those groups are consolidators, charter companies, and travel agents. Now travel agents need economies of scale. So once there's 2,000 rooms in the marketplace, there's enough rooms for the travel agents in the travel agent industry to start to pay attention. Charter companies are looking to book 50 or 100 seats on a plane and 50 and 100 hotel rooms at a time, and then they'll package them together and sell them as a bundle. But again, they need economies of scale. And consolidators are companies like Kayak and Travelocity and Orbitz and Expedia. And of course, they purchase blocks of rooms at a wholesale discount and then sell them retail, slightly discounted as well, but that's where their profit margins come from. So at the end of 2012, it was as though the match struck the matchbook. And that's really kind of where our story starts, is that at the end of 2012, we really started to see where this market was taking off. We're going to talk about what's happened since 2012 and exactly what's going to be happening for the next couple of years. So that's kind of our starting point. This is an aerial photo. Just to put some context to that map that we saw, the barrier reef is right here on the east side of the island. As I mentioned, it's the largest living barrier reef in the world. It's 185 miles long. The water inside the reef here is protected and sheltered, and this is only 6 to 10 feet deep. Just to give you an example, outside the barrier reef, you have the deepest water in all of the Caribbean, 3,000 to 3,500 feet deep. So this is a solid wall. You can't see it from here, but it's a solid wall that's more than a half-mile high that's protecting and sheltering and harboring the island of Ambergris Key. Now from the west coast to the mainland is 12 miles, just so we know where we're located relative to the mainland. And then this is the town of San Pedro right here. So that's the major population center on the island of 22,000. Now, anytime you're looking at investing in a real estate market, you have to understand what the foundation pillars are. What is the market built upon? Unless we understand the critical drivers or the foundation pillars, then we don't really have a basis of understanding of where the market is and where the market is headed. So in this particular case, there's really 3 fundamental foundation pillars in the marketplace. The two strongest are tourism and the baby boomers. The third one is a contrarian pillar. It actually moves in the opposite direction. We'll talk about that briefly at the end. But tourism and the baby boomers, either one of those foundation pillars, and we're going to talk about both of them, either one of them provides a very compelling example in its own right, but when you look at them together, it really provides a very interesting dynamic relative to this market. So in looking at tourism, first we want to try to have an understanding of what type of recognition has there been in the international media, the international marketplace, in terms of Ambergris Caye as a tourism destination. Well, there's a very popular publication called Islands Magazine. Islands Magazine has rated Ambergris Caye one of the top 10 islands in the world to live on each year for each of the last 9 years. Now, there's 500,000 readers, about 220,000 subscribers, and the same publication has said that Ambergris Caye is the best island in the world to retire to. So some pretty strong accolades there from a recognition standpoint. Now, we mentioned that in 2012, we really expected the market to start to take off because of reaching 2,000 rooms. So let's take a look. Let's look at 2011 so we have a benchmark or a starting point so we can measure the growth. So 2011 was in and of itself a new all-time record. And that's very important to understand because when I share with you what the growth was in 2012, you have to ask yourself, compared to what? If I told you that the growth was really strong in 2012, but it had dropped 20% the year before and all it did was get back to equilibrium, then that wouldn't be as compelling a story. So 2007 was the previous record for tourism, and then we had the recession, and we had a slowdown just like everywhere else. We actually had a 2% drop. The rest of the Caribbean had an average of a 20% drop in tourism, but ours was much milder. We had a 2% drop, and then by 2011, we'd already exceeded the previous high. So if 2011 was our all-time record, we're already kind of at the pinnacle, at the top, then it makes it all the more compelling that in 2012, we saw a 16% increase, 16.3% increase in tourism. Now the reason we pay attention to tourism as a real estate investor is it's what we call a leading indicator. If you have 100 people go into a tourism market, a tourism destination such as Ambergris Caye, then a certain percentage of them are going to choose to purchase a second home, an investment property, a third home, a retirement home, or perhaps raw land to land bank for equity appreciation. We don't know what percentage that is, but we can just, we'll refer to it as X. So X percent of people going into a given market in any given year are going to choose sometime in the next year to take action investing in that market. So that unknown variable is X. If tourism increases by 16%, meaning that our 100 people turns into 116 people, then it stands to reason that X would also increase by 16.3%. So it's very easy for us to actually have a forward look at what's going to happen relative to real estate demand and real estate values and even rental demand by paying close attention to our overnight tourist arrivals. And that's why, as a student of the market, we key in and focus on that. So our 16.3% increase, just to put that in context, if there's 2,000 rooms in the marketplace, and I'll try not to overwhelm you with math, but if there's 2,000 rooms in the marketplace, and there's a 16% increase in demand, then the number of rooms or condos or villas that we would need to have built in that year just to absorb that demand would be 16.3% of 2,000. It would be 326 doors, is how we refer to it. So the question is, if the demand was for another 326 doors, did we build, and were there 326 more units added to the market? And the answer was no. There weren't 326, there weren't 300, there weren't 200, there weren't 150 or 100, there were 30. So the whole island, all of the condos, villas, bed and breakfast, and hotel rooms together, we added 30 rooms, 30 doors in 2012. Now why is that? Because it's very slow for a market to pick up and accelerate when in relation to tourism can grow very quickly. And we're going to talk about the airlines and the new flights that are coming in and how quickly the tourism numbers can change. But it's much faster to add a plane load of people than it is to build the number of hotel rooms that are required for that plane load of people. And that's where the opportunity presents itself in this market. So 2012, our demand outstripped our increase in demand outstripped our increase in supply 10-1 was the ratio. In 2013, we had an additional 6.1% increase in overnight tourism. In 2014, so far year to date, we have an additional 11.8%. So if you add up just those 3 years, because it's a progressive increase, it's increase on top of increase, it's a 38% increase in tourism in the last 3 years. So it helps us to understand from the demand side of things where we stand. Now, the important question as a potential real estate investor is all of that growth happening just in one time of year, or is it split pretty evenly throughout the year? And the reason we ask that is if all the growth was just in one season, or just in a couple months of the year, then we could very quickly reach maximum capacity and there's no more room for growth in that particular season. The healthiest form of growth would be if we could see that that 38% increase actually occurred in all 12 months of the year, and that's exactly what we see here on this chart. This shows us month by month, from 2010 right through the first 6 months of this year. We can compare January to January to January. We can compare February's and March and April. So the blue is January, the red is February. We can see that March is the busiest month, the most tourism arrivals. September, October are our fewest tourism arrivals. But year over year, we've continued to grow in all seasons and all months of the year. So it's been a consistent growth. And even in the third quarter of this year, our most recent news article from a month ago, Belize boasts impressive numbers in third quarter tourist arrivals. We're actually on track now for 14% growth year over year by the end of 2014. Now, we mentioned some of the accolades that Ambergris Caye has received. TripAdvisor, millions of reviews from people in 82 countries, has rated Ambergris Caye the #1 island in the world from a tourism perspective for the last 2 years, 2013 and again this year in 2014. I think even more significantly, TripAdvisor said that Ambergris Caye is one of the top 10 destinations on the rise, or one of the top 10 up-and-coming destinations in all the world. That's an even stronger argument. There's only so many islands in the world, but every tourist destination qualifies as to whether or not it's up-and-coming. And so in this particular regard, I think that's even stronger. So from a historical perspective, we have the context that in the last 3 years, we've gone from an all-time record to 38% growth on top of the all-time record. The question is, what about the future? And why is it that I'm so bullish? Why am I so convinced we're going to have even stronger growth in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years than we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years? Well, I'll show you exactly the reasons why. And we turn to the airlines for this. The great thing about the airlines is that they do research and due diligence for you that you don't have to pay for. Now, when we talk about the airlines, do you think that the airlines say, if we fly it, they will come, and they just randomly decide to add planes and routes and new hubs? Well, of course not. The airlines are able to look at their own internal reservation system, and they can see exactly where there's increased demand. They can tell exactly when they need to add additional routes, additional flights, when they need to have new hubs to a destination. For example, United Airlines has flights from Houston to Belize, but they know all of the cities that people are connecting from through Houston to come to Belize. At some point, when they see that there's enough people going from Chicago to Houston to Belize, they'll add a direct flight from Chicago. Does that make sense? So with that in mind, there's currently 3 major carriers, American, which of course includes US Airways, Delta Airlines, and United Airlines. So if we just look at what the current airlines are doing, if we see that they're adding new flights, then that definitively tells us that we're going to have an increase in tourism. It's as simple as that. If they're decreasing flights, we would expect that there'll be a drop in tourism. So in order to understand where the demand is, let's take a look and see exactly between last December and this December, what have the airlines done and what are the new announcements that they've made? Well, if we look here, starting in the top left-hand corner, American Airlines decided to increase their flights, direct flights from Dallas, Texas to Belize from 4 flights a week to 7 flights a week. That's pretty impressive. If we look at United Airlines, last December, United increased their direct flights from Newark, New Jersey to Belize from 1 flight a week to 4 flights a week. That's a pretty big increase. United also announced in June of this year that they're going to initiate direct flights from Chicago to Belize starting this December. So those additions give us an additional 800 seats per week to and from Belize from Newark and Chicago, 640 seats from Dallas to Belize. Delta last December commenced nonstop service between Los Angeles and Belize for the first time. Prior to that, there hadn't been direct flights from anywhere in the western United States. And Delta just announced this summer in June that starting this month, November, they're increasing from 7 flights a week, 1 flight a day from Atlanta, to 12 direct flights a week from Atlanta, from 7 to 12 flights. That's an additional 960 seats per week on Delta Airlines. Now, in fairness, not all of those flights will operate on a year-round basis, because if you add up 800, 640, and 960, you'll notice those add up to more than 1,600, but 1,600 is the average additional passenger seats per week based on these 3 airlines. Within the tourism industry, there's a ratio, it's 1.6 to 1. If there's a 160 passenger plane, that requires 100 hotel rooms, because you have some single occupancy and some double occupancy. So 1,600 additional passenger seats is 1,000 hotel rooms. Not all in Ambergris Key, mind you, but spread around the country of Belize. That's how much additional room capacity we have for the country. But of course, the #1 tourism destination is going to have the lion's share of that increased traffic. Now, if that was the only news with the airlines, that would be pretty exciting. But do you think that all of the other airlines in the world are sitting back passively and saying, well, we'll just leave it to these guys to increase the passenger load? Well, of course not. They're able to see the reviews on TripAdvisor. They're able to discern that the demand exists. And so we have 3 new airlines coming to Belize in the first half of 2015. Those airlines, and this information is been shared with me directly by the Minister of Tourism and the Minister of Civil Aviation. So these announcements haven't been made public. I would encourage you to Google it. You'll find that you aren't going to find news articles talking specifically about these airlines yet, but these announcements will be forthcoming very shortly. So the first of those 3 airlines is Southwest, the largest domestic carrier in the United States. Southwest is currently building their first international terminal at Houston Hobby Airport. They started construction last September, and it'll be finished in early 2015. So we anticipate Houston Hobby being one of the hubs, but there's also the very good likelihood that BWI, that Baltimore, would be the second hub city for Southwest. We also have JetBlue. JetBlue has direct flights from JFK, from Orlando, and Fort Lauderdale as hub cities, so we're not sure which of those hub cities will originate flights. And then our third airline is an airline that is based in Panama. Copa Airlines is the national airline of Panama. So not as familiar to you likely as JetBlue or Southwest, but we're very excited about Copa as well, because it opens up all of South America and South American investors to Belize with just one-stop connectivity through Panama. So that's a very exciting development for us. Now, we've talked about most of our tourism in Belize is from the US and Canadian markets, but we had a recent development that's really going to increase the European travelers. Our local airline in Belize is called Tropic Air. And Tropic Air, in May of 2013, about a year and a half ago, started flying just 1 flight a week between Cancun, Mexico, and Belize International Airport. And the whole reason for that 1 flight a week was to make it easier for European travelers to get to Belize and not have to go through the United States. Now, why would that be? To go through the United States, a European traveler has to get a US visa, first of all, which isn't always easy to do. And on top of getting a US visa, they can't make a connecting flight the same day. So it takes 2 days to fly from Europe to Belize and 2 days to fly home. Well, if you have 4 travel days and you have to get a US visa, then that's problematic, that's cumbersome. So our local airline in Belize, a year and a half ago, decided they would offer direct flights from Cancun, because you can fly from Europe to Cancun direct from London, Barcelona, Frankfurt, and Paris. And with those direct flights, they could connect the same day through Cancun and make it to Belize. Well, that route proved to be so popular that they quickly went from 1 flight a week to 3 flights a week. And the first half of this year compared to the first half of last year, our European travelers are up 23%. On November 1st of this year, just a few weeks ago, Tropic increased from 3 flights a week to 9 times a week from Belize to Cancun, Mexico. And this news article from June tells us exactly the reason I just described. Tropic Air increases flights to Cancun to allow for same-day European connections. So that's going to be some tremendous, tremendous growth within the European market, going from 1 flight a week to 3 flights a week to 9 flights a week. And we now have flights to Cancun from Frankfurt, London, Manchester, Paris, Madrid, Munich, and Amsterdam. And so it's convenient for all of those travelers to make it to Belize in just 1 day. That's the tourism sector. And we're not going to spend near as much time on the other two, but tourism in and of itself, if we just stopped right there and said that's the market overview, this is where we stand from a tourism perspective, it'd be a pretty compelling argument that, yeah, there's definitely some demand here, this is definitely an interesting position to be in. But arguably, the baby boomers are every bit as strong a market, or an even more compelling reason to look at this from an investment perspective. And here's the reason why. First of all, we all know that the baby boomers are not a hypothesis or a theory. They represent the largest demographic wave of people to move through human society in any of our lifetimes or any other generation for that matter. 76 million Americans born between 1946 and 1964, and if you include those who immigrated to the United States over the last 50, 60 years, it's 79 million Americans that make up the baby boomers. This chart shows us by U.S. births, the number of births, but it doesn't tell the story. It doesn't tell the story at all. If you look at elementary schools, this is just to highlight and emphasize how big a demographic the baby boomers make up. 90% of the elementary schools in the United States were built in one decade, the 1950s. That's how big an impact the baby boomers have had on society. They're going to have an even bigger impact as they relocate in retirement. This chart, I think, tells the story even more so. At the beginning of 2011, we're going to use 2011 as our baseline. That was the first year that the baby boomers started to reach the age of 65. So at the beginning of 2011, the number of Americans every single day that turned 65 was 7,000. 7,000 Americans a day. Just 2 years later, that number increased to 10,000 a day. That's a 42.8% increase. That's a huge, huge jump in 2 years. But the average for the whole 18 years that it's going to take the baby boomers to reach the age of 65, the average is another 17.5% higher. From here to here, from 2011 to what the average is for the next 18 years, is an increase of 68%. Just imagine a river rising 68% and overflowing its banks, and it's at flood stage. And the flood waters don't recede for 18 years. Imagine how much bigger volume of water that is than what that river normally holds. That's how big an impact the baby boomers are going to have. And what do they all have in common? Whether they act on it or not, desirable retirement destinations. And we'll talk in just a moment about exactly what percentage do plan to relocate. But just for the moment, think back to childhood and the game of musical chairs. With musical chairs, if there's 10 people playing the game, you start with 9 chairs. There's one more person than there is chairs, and when the music stops, whoever doesn't get a chair is out until the next round goes on. Well, in this game of musical chairs, picture it that every chair in this room represents a different retirement destination. One chair is Costa Rica, one chair is Scottsdale, Arizona, another chair is Destin, Florida, another chair is Fargo, North Dakota. Now you might say, Fargo, North Dakota, I didn't know that was a popular retirement destination. Well, it's not. The people who live there, many of them will retire there, but there probably won't be a lot of people relocating to Fargo who didn't already live in North Dakota. So that chair will be smaller. That chair won't be necessarily as desirable. And that's no criticism of Fargo or any other place that doesn't have a large influx of retirees. But what it helps us to appreciate is that the number of chairs remain the same, because the number of retirement destinations is pretty fixed. There's nobody building more land or creating more land. And so, even though the number of chairs stay the same, the number of people who enter the game of musical chairs increases by 11,765 a day for 18 years straight. So if we could find out where people are heading and invest there before they arrive, that would be a good thing. That was Roy Rogers' quote. Find out where people are heading and invest there before they arrive. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Where are Americans heading? Well, according to a study by the AARP, 59% of baby boomers plan to relocate. And it should come as no surprise that the top 2 destinations are Arizona and Florida. What we're interested in is the other 28 million who plan to relocate somewhere else. Where do they plan to go? And in particular, how many of them plan to retire abroad, and how are they going to make their decision? Well, we need a baseline. So our starting point is that in 2013, at the end of last year, there were 350,000 Americans that retired abroad. Not all in 1 year, but cumulatively, 350,000 Americans collected their Social Security outside of the United States. So that's our baseline. Now, just in the next 10 years, According to surveys by Zogby International and the Medical Tourism Center for Medical Tourism Research in Austin, Texas, the number of Americans who've already decided to retire abroad in the next decade is 3.3 million, almost 10 times that number. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because that doesn't include the 17 million who are interested or very interested in doing so. We're only talking about those who've already decided, who have either already bought property or are actively pursuing retirement abroad and have a timetable within the next 10 years. So these numbers are huge in comparison to the current number retired abroad. So it begs the question, well, where are they going to go? Well, the Central America and Caribbean region is the #1 region for anticipated growth of retirees abroad. And the number 3.3 million, has increased every single year in a row since 2005. So pre-recession, during the recession, post-recession, as we become more of a global society, the number of Americans every year increases who are looking to retire and live abroad. And so then, of course, when we ask the question throughout this whole region, all of the Caribbean and Central America, if that's the #1 focus of where these people are going to go, how are they possibly going to decide where to retire? I would venture to say that they're going to make a list. And when they make a list, they're going to put on the list what's important to them. Not what was important to me, but I bet a lot of them are similar. For example, 91% of Americans only speak English. I think that there will be a disproportionate number of Americans who look at English-speaking destinations. For example, of the 350,000 Americans who are currently collecting Social Security outside of the United States, 1 in 7 are in Mexico. 50,000 Americans retired abroad in Mexico. Is there anything that's happening in Mexico these last few years that might cause those numbers to change? Absolutely, and it's very unfortunate. But I think there's going to be a disproportionate shift in where people are looking to retire abroad. And as they go through their list and they determine what their qualifications are, then I would venture to say that the island that is rated the #1 place in the world to retire to, and the #1 place in the world to vacation to, is probably going to get its disproportionate share. I think that International Living Magazine summed it up quite nicely when they said that Belize is the top English-speaking retirement haven in the Caribbean. So I think that's a very good way of putting it. Now, with that in mind, there's an interesting study from the World Tourism Organization that reveals that the baby boomers are expected to double the size of the tourism industry in the next decade. So now we're talking about two foundation pillars and how they interact with each other. And I find this fascinating. The idea of the tourism industry is huge in and of itself. The very notion of that industry, as big as it is, doubling, it is hard to comprehend. And so I had to really sit and think about this for a while. How is it that the baby boomers are going to double the size of the tourism industry? And then it became very clear. If a couple retires abroad and they have children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews and friends and associates, and it's a desirable retirement destination, well, they're probably going to come visit. And if they come visit, then that's going to increase tourism. So those areas that have a disproportionate increase in baby boomers relocating and retiring are also looking to have a doubling in the size of the tourism industry. But there's another correlation between the baby boomers and tourism, and it's this. Let's just say, for sake of argument, that this little green house right here is owned by Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And Mr. and Mrs. Smith go for, say, 2 weeks a year, and when they go to Belize for 2 weeks a year, they stay in their house and they enjoy it. And when they're not in the house, they rent it out. And they have professional management that rents it on a nightly or weekly basis for 50 weeks of the year. Well, who stays there? These people do. These are the tourists, the families and couples and individuals who come and rent that little green house for 50 weeks of the year. But Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who only stay here 2 weeks a year and rent it out the rest of the time, they decide to sell that little greenhouse to Mr. and Mrs. Jones. And Mr. and Mrs. Jones are baby boomers who are looking to retire. And so their plan is not to rent out the house for 50 weeks of the year. Their plan is to move into the house and to live in it. So that little greenhouse is no longer available to these people. Our rental inventory goes from 2,000 and drops by 1 down to 1,999. So what's happening in the marketplace is this group is increasingly coming in and buying property to move into. They're actually taking rental inventory and converting it for their own personal use. So our supply is dwindling. We're not building even to keep up with our loss of supply. And on top of that, our tourism, our demand side has increased 38% in the last 3 years. And what's happened as a result of that is that in the last 2 years, our hotels, our resorts, our condos on Ambergris Key have been running above 90% occupancy. One of the big concerns that we have as a market is how much business we're turning away. And that's a very serious concern. Because if you're turning away business over and over because the hotels and the condos are full, at some point you're going to upset the apple cart and people are going to be frustrated because they can't come and stay in the marketplace. So we just simply aren't building inventory fast enough. It's what I refer to as the overflowing bathtub. If you leave the stopper in the bathtub and the bathtub is dripping, and you come back at the end of a 3 or 4 day trip, and the bathtub is 3/4 full, you breathe a sigh of relief that the tub's not overflowing. But if you come home and the bathtub's overflowing, how do you measure how much water's gone over the edge? There's no way to measure that. In fact, you ask yourself, when did the tub start overflowing? Did it overflow as soon as I left or just before I got home? And there's no way to measure how much water went out. All you can do is try to calculate the damage that was caused. And so in our market, we have an overflowing bathtub. At 90% occupancy, we're overflowing. We know that people are not able to come. They're being turned away when they go to book flights or they go to book hotel rooms. The airlines are taking care of the flight component. We know the demand is there because the airlines are adding flights. But we need to add more inventory, and that's specifically why we're talking about the investment opportunity this evening that we're working on. The last foundation pillar is the exodus of capital from the U.S. This is what I call the contrarian pillar. In 2009, during the height of the recession, and this is a photo of my office there in San Pedro. My office is directly across from the airstrip, from the terminal, Tropic Air Terminal. So when you get off the plane, the very first thing you see is my office, and that's by design. It works out very well that way. And a lot of people get off the plane, come across the street, come in the office. And in 2009, we had a very interesting phenomenon. We still had the same market that we had had previously in 2005, 6, 7, and 8. We still had people buying second homes and vacation homes and investment property. We still had people land banking and buying for equity appreciation. So that market stayed the same, but we had a whole new market that came out of nowhere. We had people that came in the door and looked me in the eye and said, I just lost 30 to 40% of my portfolio. I just had a 30 or 40% reduction in net worth because of the recession, because of what happened. And I don't know how it happened, I don't know what happened, but I know that I can no longer look at retiring on the same timetable. And these are people that used to be concerned about what their ROI, their return on investment was, and whether the return on investment of one deal was better than another. And they looked at me at that time and said, I'm more concerned about the return of my investment than the return on my investment. Literally, there were investors that said, what property can I buy for $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000? And my only goal is that 2 years from now, 3 years from now, it will be worth the same amount. That's my goal. They weren't concerned about how much it was going to go up in value. They just wanted to know that it wasn't going to disappear, that it wasn't going to drop 30%. They wanted a property that would be the equivalent of buying a bar of gold or having a safety deposit box or a Swiss bank account. And so we actually had an increase in real estate sales, an increase in demand, an increase in appreciation in 2009. As hard to believe as that is. With $3 trillion of cash on the sidelines of the stock market in the United States and people braced and fearful and not knowing what was a safe haven and where they could safely deploy their capital, there was a massive exodus of capital out of the U.S. and it was looking for a safe haven. It was looking for either a tax haven or a banking haven, but somewhere that there was economic surety. And as a result of that, we saw a tremendous influx of capital and investment, and we saw an increase in real estate values. So as I mentioned, our tourism dropped. We had a 2% drop, so that would have affected your return on your cash flow and your property, but we had a corresponding increase in values. And the reason that's important to understand is that it isn't as though we won't have another recession or another downturn or market cycles. We would have to have our head in the sand to think that was the case. I just heard on the radio this afternoon about how the government is looking at what they can do to stimulate home sales, because home sales aren't growing as fast as they have been, and they're expecting that we're going to have 3% down mortgages here again in the near future. And I just thought to myself, does nobody remember what happened the last time and how quickly things unwound? And so with that in mind, it's important to understand it's not a question of if the market goes down, it's what will happen when the market goes down. And we have a very, very clear and recent historical perspective. We have a tendency to put the recession in the context of our own experience. If we lived somewhere, if we lived in one part of the U.S. that was more negatively impacted than another, then all of the people in that region perceived that the whole country was affected the same way. In Belize, our perception of the recession is that it was a boom. And I don't say that contritely, it's that one person's misery is going to cause growth somewhere else. And so economic uncertainty in the U.S., the fact that Belize has the highest reserve requirements, that became highly desirable. People wanted to go to somewhere there was never a history of bank failure. So that helps us to understand the synopsis of the market, what the three foundation pillars are. And it was important to set that table, to have you really truly understand the market so that you could then understand exactly what we're building and developing and exactly what the investment opportunity is. So I appreciate that you're paying attention. I know it was a ton of information. It was like trying to drink a glass of water from a fire hydrant. And so I know that many of you have a full brain right now. There's one last photo I have to share with you. Because I started the story about my family, I selfishly put this photo in because it reminds me when I do this presentation that quality of life is what brought my family and I to Belize in the first place. And even though it's been a tremendous, tremendous opportunity for me from a business standpoint as a real estate investor, it's quality of life that keeps me there. My wife and I constantly say that if it doesn't offer the best quality of life, we can own our businesses and our properties and our investments and really live anywhere in the world. But every quarter of every year for 9 years, we've done an objective analysis and said this is still the best place we can imagine living. But this photo shows my son on the right. My son is now 17. He's grown up a little bit since he was 8 years old. Our little infant Lauren that was just a baby in the earlier photo is here on the left. She didn't know Daddy was taking the photos, so she doesn't have a big pretty smile on her face like she normally does. And we had just finished catching 50 lobster spearfishing. And before we went to have our beach barbecue, there were 10 of us on the boat. We had 6 kids and 4 adults. It was my family and another family. So we were free diving, snorkeling, and caught 50 lobster. And then decided, of course, nobody wants to eat just lobster. You got to have a balanced diet. So we decided to spear some fish. And our first fish was a 70-pound grouper. And we said, okay, we can stop. We're done. That's more than we can eat. And so I stick this photo in here because it reminds me of what's important. I'm certainly excited about a good real estate investment opportunity, but I want to make sure I keep my priorities set. And so this photo here reminds me every time I look at it. So I appreciate you indulging me with that. So our project is called Mahogany Bay Village. It's located just immediately adjacent to the town core. So it's 1 mile from the airstrip, which is the focal point of the island of San Pedro. Of course, you have to look at transportation and proximity to the airstrip to be able to undertake such a project as we have. Mahogany Bay Village is 67 acres, so it's a very, very large project. It took 5 years to go through all of the entitlement process, all the permitting and approvals with the Department of Environment, all of the dredging and excavating. We have a large body of water called Mahogany Bay. These are all canals that are 6 to 8 feet deep, and each of these are roads. Effectively, the road goes down the middle, and there's properties on either side of it. So these are cul-de-sacs, or fingers. So there's 8 cul-de-sacs. In fact, you can't be anywhere in the property, in the 67 acres, that you're more than 75 feet away from the water. So there's 421 lots, or 421 individually titled parcels of land, and we're really building a master-planned Caribbean resort village. So the village has, at its heart, a 4-star resort hotel, surrounded by residential residences such as single-family homes and townhouses. There'll be 6 to 8 restaurants. There's a bay club and a beach club, swimming pool, farmer's market. There's retail, commercial, and so it's really a comprehensive Caribbean village. We've hired world-class architects and designers who've done this exact same type of development in other parts of the Caribbean very successfully. A project called Schooner Bay in Abaco in the Bahamas, Camana Bay in Grand Cayman in the Cayman Islands, Rosetown in Jamaica, Alice Beach in the seaside in Florida, and now Mahogany Bay Village in Ambergris, Belize. And so we're going to go from this photo to a site plan of the resort. So the first phase of the resort is 195 rooms. That's what is going to open for occupancy September of 2015. So we will have finished the construction of the 195 room resort the end of February, and that'll give us sufficient time to have all of the units fully furnished, turnkey. We've hired a multinational hotel operator out of the United States called Scout Hotels. Scout manages resorts and properties in Nantucket, Cape Cod, all throughout New England, all the way down the east coast to Florida. And so we've brought them in as our multinational hotel operator, and they're going to open for operation September of next year. Now, 195 rooms. The consultants that we've hired, we hired PKF Consultants, the largest hotel consulting firm in the United States, to come and do a market analysis for us. We wanted to know what the market absorption would be on 195 rooms, and if we should hold off on that and not build anything else for the time being, or if we needed a plan to build additional inventory. And their response was that we definitely would need additional inventory. We needed a plan to immediately follow up with a second phase to go to 350 rooms based on the existing demand. So that caused us to actually stop the construction process on the Bay Club. The Bay Club is our large pool and restaurant facility that overlooks Mahogany Bay. This was originally built to accommodate a population of 195 hotel rooms, but Scout said that that second phase is going to be necessary. I'm sorry, PKF Consultant said the second phase is going to be necessary so soon that we needed to go ahead and plan the amenities and services for the 350 rooms, even though we're not building all 350 to start. So this is the resort component, and then these other streets will have the residences. We're also anticipating building a conference center here on the first street. There are no conference centers on the island of Ambergris Key at all, and we've got plenty of room with 67 acres to include that in the plan. This is a close-up of the, I say resort hotel. It's not a hotel like what you would picture. Because of the amount of land we have, it's a very, very low-density construction. A lot of lush tropical jungle landscaping. Everything is 1-story or 2-story. The height restriction on Ambergris Key is 4-story. You can't build anything taller than a 4-story building. And there's a very simple reason for that. It wasn't because all the architects and engineers and town planners got together and determined that that was the optimal height. They literally got together and said, a mature coconut palm tree grows to an average height of 44 feet, so let's not build anything taller than that. That happens to be 4 stories. So in all seriousness, that's our building code, is you can't build taller than 4 stories. And we've limited our construction to 1- and 2-story construction. So even though it's a 4-star resort hotel, typically as an investor, we don't have the opportunity to invest in a resort hotel. Hotels have the highest return, the highest cap rate of any real estate asset class in the United States, but hotels are typically a very expensive entry point into real estate. Because we have individually titled parcels, we've been able to structure it so that the management of the entirety of the hotel resort can be handled by one company, but we've been able to structure it so that individual investors and individual real estate syndications are able to actually own a portion of the resort, but have the economies of scale to have it managed as part of the larger resort. So tonight what we're talking about is a real estate syndication that is raising $2.3 million to own 10 of the 195 rooms that are in the first phase of the resort, to actually have fee simple title, to have whole ownership of 3 lots, 3 parcels of land, and all of the improvements on the property. So for example, this is one parcel of land. This has a family cottage, which is a 3-bedroom home, and 2 guest cottages. So these can be rented as individual hotel rooms. This can be rented as a 2- or a 3-bedroom house. And the 2- or 3-bedroom house can become a 4- or 5-bedroom rental with the inclusion of these as satellite bedrooms. We also have what are called garden cottages, 3 garden cottages on one parcel, individual cottages. And then we have what are called keeping suites. The keeping suites are effectively a 4-plex. So it's 4 hotel suites with a kitchenette, a living room, in addition to the bedroom and bathroom. And so those are our product types for the resort hotel. This is an aerial photo that was taken last month. It shows that 150 of the 195 units have been constructed. We obviously still have the landscaping to go in. There's a long way to go before we open next September. Our target, our goal was to have 60 units sold and built by November, and instead we're at 150. At 150, this makes this the largest resort or hotel in the country of Belize. Currently the largest operating hotel is 120 rooms, so we're well ahead of schedule, and as I mentioned, our anticipated construction build-out of the first 195 units will be the end of February. We're able to build a fully turnkey finished lot, which is 3 to 4 units, in approximately 3 months' time. And at our current rate of construction, we're able to build an entire lot, or to turn an entire lot of inventory every week. We've got a production building facility on the mainland. This is another aerial photo. Again, so at this point in time, there's approximately $36 million of equity that's been raised in the project. and there's no debt against the project whatsoever. So everything that you see, all of the land, all of the improvements, totals about $36 million, and there are no mortgages, liens, or encumbrances against the property at all. This is the back of the coffee shop. The coffee shop is here on the left. That's our first retail operation. This is our Discovery Center, or our sales center. And then from the other side of these two buildings, this is what the view looks like. So these are those same two buildings. This is the coffee shop here. These are some artist renderings showing the British colonial style architecture. Of course, these were pre-construction before we had built anything. And now that we've got constructed units, the interiors are open woods. You have the beautiful Santa Maria and mahogany woods that are exposed. Again, it's a British colonial style architecture. I like to say that it's James Bond meets Ralph Lauren. 4-star resort inventory on the island averages about $300 to $375 a night. Our projections are much, much more conservative than that because we want to ensure that we underpromise and overdeliver. But our architects who are responsible for the design have won Cottage of the Year in Coastal Living magazine and several other accolades as top world-class architects. So we have the keeping suite floor plans. This particular syndication includes one lot of keeping suites, so there are 4 of these suites, or one fourplex. And then we have 2 lots each lot consisting of a family cottage, which is 1,246 square feet, and 2 garden cottages at 392 square feet. And so there are 2 of these lots. That would include 4 garden cottages and 2 family cottages. So as I mentioned again, a total of 10 units of inventory. So the investment itself is a total equity raise of $2.3 million. In just a moment, I'm going to talk about what our assumptions are with regard to occupancy and rental rates, so you know what basis we're using. The minimum investment is $100,000. There are IRAs allowed, so if you have a solo 401k or a self-directed IRA, if you're not familiar with what a self-directed IRA is, or if you need help or assistance, then we can certainly help you with that. I'll just mention very briefly that if you have money from a previous job that's still in a 401k, you can roll that over to an IRA. I would highly recommend that you convert or roll over an IRA to a self-directed IRA. I don't have a dog in the fight, as they say. I don't have a vested interest in your doing that, but what I can tell you is it opens up your investment options considerably because your IRA custodian typically has a very limited number of investment options for you, and a self-directed IRA gives you tremendous flexibility, and there are many, many more options of what you're allowed to invest in. There's a lot of misconceptions about being able to invest in real estate with your IRA, and so much so that the IRS, on the irs.gov website, actually has a detailed explanation that though your custodian isn't obligated to allow you to invest your funds, you do have the discretion of choosing another custodian, and you are perfectly within your rights, legally within your IRA, to purchase and invest in real estate. So certainly would recommend that you follow up with Dave afterwards. We can certainly refer you to some of the top custodians in the country. And again, we don't have a specific vested interest with any of them. So it's really just a matter of helping you with regard to finding the right custodian and making that transition. So the projected annual investor profit is $275,869 on a $2.3 million raise. It gives us a projected annual investor ROI of right at 12%. Now, I will say that knowing Dave's experience with multifamily investment here in the United States, as well as his typical investor returns, I know that if he thought that this was truly going to return a 12% return, that he wouldn't be interested in doing the project. And I can say that for myself as well. For me to borrow money in Belize, it cost me 10 to 10.5%. That's what the banks loan at in Belize. And yet I borrow as much as I possibly can at 10% interest because I can arbitrage or make a spread large enough that the 10% is very palatable. So the 12% is an extremely conservative projection, but we wanted to be, again, err on the side of caution, and I'm going to show you exactly what our basis was for determining the 12%. I also want to mention that there is a financing option after stabilization. We've met with several lenders in the United States who have expressed a tremendous amount of interest that once we've been open and operational for 6 to 12 months minimum, and they're able to see that the cash flow is substantiated by operating history, that they're very interested in coming in at what would ordinarily be subprime rates in the United States, for example, 7 or 8% financing with a 70, 75, 80% loan to value. To them, if they can loan on Class A resort property with qualified investors who've already paid cash in full for the asset, then they're very comfortable loaning at those interest rates and those loan-to-value ratios. And I can tell you that a 7 or 8% loan at 75% loan-to-value would return almost 100% of the investor equity to each of the investors in the syndication. And at that point, once you've returned or received the return of all of your equity, your return then becomes infinite because your return is based on 0 basis points. You no longer have your initial capital in the deal. That's the objective, that's the goal of the syndication, is to return 100% of the investor capital. Dave, in the executive summary that you'll have access to, is very conservatively saying that that'll be 3 to 5 years. I personally have been involved in meeting with lenders. That's a large part of what my next stage of involvement is to help to set up the financing. And I'm finding from lenders that they're saying that they're looking at a much shorter timetable, a much shorter time frame, because it's getting harder and harder to deploy capital and get a 7 or 8% return as a lender with a $200 or $500 million fund. And so this is very desirable to them. So the investment options, if somebody is interested in purchasing their own lot or multiple lots, not participating in the syndication, we want to make very clear there's no obligation to only invest through the syndication. The syndication is a tremendous means by which you can leverage into an investment that might be larger than you otherwise could participate in or comfortably participate in on your own. That's what a real estate syndication does, is it brings together investors to be able to find a better deal with higher returns, because typically there's better economies of scale on a larger deal. But if somebody has the wherewithal and has the interest, then we can certainly talk, and I'll be happy to talk offline about the returns and the investment for purchasing your own lot, which would be 3 to 4 doors or units of inventory. That's about a $715,000 to $750,000 investment. But the real estate syndication is really what is at the heart of our discussion tonight. The syndication, as we mentioned, is a $2.3 million raise. It is for accredited investors with a $100,000 minimum. With a $150,000 investment, there's the benefit of an additional 1 week of personal usage of one of the garden cottages, and of course that's subject to availability and not high season demand, so as not to negatively impact the return of the fellow investors. But that's 1 week of personal usage a year of a garden cottage. If the investment is at $200,000 or above, then instead of a garden cottage, that becomes a 3-bedroom family cottage. And that can be used yourself or given away, used for business purposes, family purposes, what have you. But that's a concession or a benefit of investing at that level. As we mentioned, it's a 12% projected cash-on-cash return unleveraged. Obviously, the return goes up significantly with the introduction of leverage, but don't make the investment on the basis of definitively having a leveraged return. I would go in with the assumption that that's an objective or a goal or an exit strategy, but with the expectation of a conservative 12% return. The numbers that I shared with you, the garden cottages are sold out. That was simply because it was the lowest price point, and therefore it was easier for individual investors to make that purchase. I will say up to this point, these are all wholesale prices, and the wholesale prices are what are available to the syndication. So I'm keeping suites with 4 units. This is for an outright purchase. If somebody's making their own purchase, it's $639,600, $99,000 in FF&E, for a total of $738,600. That's a turnkey, fully furnished, rent-ready cost for 4 doors. And the family cottage plus 2 garden cottages is $716,650. But back to the syndication just for a moment. I know that you can't read these numbers from your seat, and all of this is outlined in detail in the executive summary. But I just want to touch on very briefly. I've tried to give a range of scenarios because even though I'm very optimistic and the information that I've shared I think is very compelling, it begs the question, let's just assume things don't go as well as projected. They might go better, they might go the same, and they might not go as well. What's my range of return so I know what I might have to stomach? And it might be that I only have to stomach it for 6 to 12 months, but if we're talking about a recession or a downturn, then am I still going to be positive, or how negative might I be? So where we're looking at a 12% return, that's based on an occupancy of 71.78%. And I didn't intentionally choose an odd number. The 71.78 is because of taking all 3 seasons. We have holidays. The peak season is Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, New Year's, and Lobster Fest. Those are our peak season dates, about 30 days of the year that we're 100% occupancy because we're booked 6 months in advance for those dates. Our high season, I've put in at 80%, and our value season, half of the year at 60%. That gives us a blended rate of about 72% occupancy. Now, there isn't anything on the island that is actually operating as low as 72% occupancy. There hasn't been anything in the last 2 years operating at that level, and with the demand that we have, I don't anticipate us being anywhere close to 72% occupancy, but for purposes of a conservative projection, that's what we're using. With regard to the nightly rate, we can see that a garden cottage, we're saying $209.93. That's the blended average. That's $210 a night. Now, $210 a night, you have to ask compared to what? So last year on the island of Ambergris Key, if you added up all of the hotel rooms and condo inventory that was rented on a nightly basis, the ADR, the average daily rate that people paid, was $215 per night. That was high season and low season, good season and bad, and that included all discounts. So if it was buy 4 nights, get the 5th night free, or if there were any other special promotions, then the blended average that was actually physically paid was $215 per night. And that was from 1 star to 5 stars. So the average is a 2 to 2.5 star property. A 4-star property averages $300 to $375 per night. And as a 4-star property, by all rights, we could say that at stabilization, we're at $300 to $375 a night. But again, for the purpose of being conservative, we're actually coming in just under what the actual island average was last year. Now, in a more optimistic scenario, at 85% occupancy, we're looking at a 14% return to the investors, and that's after the split with the syndicator. The syndication split is an 80-20 split. So 80% of the net income goes to the equity, to the investors, and 20% goes to the syndication itself. So that being the case, let's look at our our catastrophic. We have optimistic, realistic, pessimistic, and catastrophic. So catastrophic, let's just assume that we go through a really, really rough spot for 6 to 12 months in the global economy. Now, at a 52% occupancy, that's what I'm showing here on the catastrophic model, we haven't had a 52% occupancy after 9/11 or during the recession. We haven't had anything close to that. So I'm talking a truly, truly catastrophic event for our occupancy to drop to 52%. Arguably, we're all going to have bigger issues than how our rental investment in Belize is performing. If the market here drops to 52% occupancy, then there's probably going to be bigger issues that we're dealing with. But that being the case, we're still looking at a net ROI of 7% to the equity, to the investors. So a 7% return is really our safety net. Because 52% occupancy, we just don't have a reasonable expectation of being anywhere close to that. In actuality, I've modeled it all the way down to a 25% occupancy, just for curiosity, and we still have about a 3.5% positive return. So if you've got any money in CDs or savings accounts earning 1/10%, it really, you're not keeping up with inflation, and I would highly, highly recommend that you look at asset diversification and really consider your options, because again, it's always compared to what. So with regard to next steps, I'm going to ask Dave at this time to hand out what is entitled a letter of commitment. In reality, it's an expression of interest. I don't want anybody to be fearful about this at all. Nobody is asking for any money from you here in the room. But what this is, Dave has with him tonight about 35 to 40 executive summaries. We don't have enough for everybody in the room, and so Dave's going to hand out this expression of interest. And if you think that it's something that you'd like to learn more about, that's all we're asking. If you think that you'd like to learn more about it, it seems like it would be of interest to you, and you feel that you would be qualified based on what the minimum investment is, then if you'll just simply fill out the form, you can put your email address, you can either pick up a physical copy of the executive summary tonight and take that home with you. This is what it looks like, and so you've got a bound copy of the executive summary. If you prefer to have it as a PDF in a soft copy emailed to you, then that's certainly available as well. But on the, it may be a little confusing on the letter of commitment. It may sound as though it's asking you to put money in escrow prior to reviewing the documents, and I just want to clarify that's not the case at all. The way that this would work is that if you fill out the form and you say that I think I might be interested, then what that's doing is it's opening the door to your receiving what's called the PPM, the Private Placement Memorandum, the Operating Agreement, and the Executive Summary. After you've reviewed that, obviously you're going to have questions. You're going to want to schedule either a phone appointment or a face-to-face appointment with Dave so that we can ensure that all of your questions are answered. And then if you choose to move forward with the investment, only at that point would you actually transfer money into the operating account of the LLC for the syndication to move forward with closing. So the fund's due date is Monday, December 1st, about 10 days from now. So that allows opportunity to review the executive summary and all of the documentation, all of which is prepared and ready to go. Make sure you have all of your questions answered. You may find that you choose to invest at a lower amount or a higher amount than what you initially indicated. But the initial indication is simply going to allow Dave to know who to contact first. And really, this is almost like a code check. It's his receipt to know who received an executive summary, so he knows who to follow up with. So we would ask, we just respectfully ask that you fill that out, hand that in. You can put, to be quite honest, if you put fictitious information on there, he's still going to turn around and hand you the executive summary. There's no trick, there's no game. It's just a matter of needing to know who's received the executive summary and to ensure that he's able to follow up with you. We just ask that you put your contact info on there accordingly. So the funds are due Monday, December 1st. The intent is to close on the syndication the following Monday, December 7th. If you are looking at using self-directed IRA funds, or if you need assistance in rolling over an IRA to a self-directed IRA, that may not quite be enough time, but we can work with the largest fund administrators in the country. We work with on a daily basis, and we can help you to get that process started. And if it does require a little additional time, then we can certainly make accommodation for that. So I just want to make that clear. So Dave has handed out, I think, at all the tables, the letter of commitment. Because we have so many people in the room, and also, again, just to be respectful of people's time, there's a couple of questions that tend to come up from time to time. And so if you'll allow me, and then I'll be happy, we can take 10 or 15 minutes to open it up to the floor. But there's two questions in particular that I think are probably the two most important questions to answer. And so rather than see if one of you asked them early on, I thought I would just go ahead and tell you what the question is, and then tell you what the answer is. And so the first question, and you wouldn't necessarily know to ask this, is why I kind of prefaced it that way. Early in the presentation, I mentioned that there are no fast food franchises or brands. We don't really have branded restaurants, for example. We also don't have branded hotels. There's a Best Western Hotel and a Radisson Hotel that are both located in Belize City, but we don't have a single hotel brand or flag on the island of Ambergris Key. Now, if I had told you that at the very start of the presentation, then you probably would have been thinking the whole time that I was talking, how in the world can there be all this growth in tourism and there's no Hilton or Hyatt or Sheraton or Four Seasons or Ritz-Carlton or Motel 6 or Super 8 or what have you? How could none of them be in the market? Are we kind of, now that we know this, is anyone kind of wondering how in the world that could be the case? In fact, it might even cause you to say, you know what, I kind of second guess everything I've heard tonight. If just knowing that none of those brands are in the market, that causes me to kind of step back for a second. Are any of you feel that way right now? Be honest. You should. I would if I were sitting in your shoes. I would say, well, surely all of those hotel brands are smarter than this one guy standing up there. That's what I would think. But let me tell you exactly where the disparity is, because when you understand this point, and this is the most important thing for you to understand about this market, and let me preface it by saying this. When you're investing in stocks, for example, if I say the term insider trading, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Some people say Martha Stewart, some say Bernie Madoff. We all think of jail or prison. It's not a good thing, right? In real estate, insider trading is desirable. It is not illegal. Insider trading in real estate is a smart thing, and it's different because real estate is different than trading in a security in insider trading. What I'm going to share with you is insider trading, and it's perfectly legal. So let's just assume for a second that you're a vice president of Marriott, and you open the newspaper in the morning and you see that this island has been rated the #1 island in the world by TripAdvisor. And then a few days later you read an article that Delta announces that they're going to increase from 7 flights a week from Atlanta to 12 flights a week. and you say to yourself, you know what, we need to take a look at this market. It sounds like we should be opening a hotel there. So the vice president of Marriott doesn't just hop on a plane and fly down to Belize. He talks to a junior analyst and says, hey, go do some research and find out about this market for me. And so that junior analyst now has to determine, well, where do I go to find my information? Well, the official government source is the Belize Tourism Board. And if you contact the BTB, the Belize Tourism Board, you'd probably start by asking them, can you provide me with the average annual occupancy rate for Ambergris Key? Because if you know the occupancy rate, then you have a pretty good idea of how mature the market is. Typically, you're going to want to see about a 65 to 70% occupancy. 70% is about average occupancy for any of the major metropolitan areas in the United States. What that analyst is going to find is he's going to get a report from the Belize Tourism Board, and that 10-year report is going to show an average of 49.8% over 10 years. 50% occupancy. Well, that's not exactly exciting. In fact, what that indicates to this analyst, and in turn to the vice president, is that this market isn't mature. In fact, it might even be overbuilt at this point. 50% occupancy means that half of the rooms are vacant on any given night. So that vice president immediately looks at this report and says, oh, it's ahead of its time. You know, I get it. It's a top 10 up-and-coming destination. Sounds like it's a top place. They just have more rooms than are needed right now, so we'll check back in another 2 or 3 years. But that would be the wrong conclusion. And I'll tell you the problem, and I discovered it in 2010, and I spent over a year trying to get the Belize Tourism Board to change their calculations and their reporting. And here's the problem. If you have pen and paper handy, you might want to just jot down some of these numbers, but I'm going to give you a real-life example. There's a project on Ambergris Key called Grand Caraïbe. Grand Caraïbe has 74 condos. Of those 74 condos, 46 of them are in the rental pool. There's 46 out of 74 in the rental pool. 10 out of 74 are owner-occupied. People live in them full-time. These are baby boomers that we were talking about. If you take 46 plus 10 is 56. 56 from 74 leaves 18. So what are those 18? Those 18 are what we call lock-in leaves. These are people who own a condo as a second home, and when they're there, they use it. When they're not, they lock it up, they leave it, and they don't want anybody else staying there. They might have their family photos, their furniture, their personal effects, and they're perfectly within their rights to do that. They don't want anybody else inside. So only 46 of the units at any given time are available for rental. But even those 46 units have owners who at some point are going to stay in them. Most owners are going to use theirs for a couple weeks or maybe a month, a year. But on the best of circumstances, the most that you could ever have rented out is 46 units. Do we understand how that would be with 46 in the rental pool? When you check into a hotel in Belize, Belize is based on simplicity. We pay our taxes once a month instead of once a year. Why is that? Because Belize operates like a small business, net 30 days. On the 15th of November, we pay our October taxes. The 15th of December, we pay our November taxes. It just makes sense. Our tax form is one sheet of paper. And based on what industry you're in, it's a flat tax or a gross tax. If you own investment property or a hotel, it's 1.75% of the gross. It's as simple as that. So, when you check into a hotel, you have your name, your passport number, your check-in date, your check-out date, and what the nightly rate is, and that's a carbon copy form. Now, this isn't computerized, this is manual. Again, very simple. So the hotel keeps a carbon copy of your slip from when you stay there, and their responsibility is to collect the hotel tax. Now, the hotel tax is paid by the guest. The hotel pays the 1.75% on what the nightly rate is, but the guest pays 12.5% hotel tax on the nightly rate. So let's say there's a $100 room rate. The guest pays $112.50. The hotel pays $12.50 to the government on the 15th of next month because they collected that hotel tax for the government. So Grand Caraïbe has 46 units. So if they have 46 slips of paper after tonight, then what was their occupancy for the night? You have 46 slips of paper, and there's 46 condos in the rental pool. What's your occupancy rate? 100%, right? Wrong. Because the Belize Tourism Board counts the 46 slips of paper, and then they check their record and they say, let's see, Grand Caraïbe, they check the hotel tax license file and they say Grand Caraïbe has 74 condos, 46 divided by 74 is 62%. So we're going to put down 62% occupancy. Now, I discovered this in 2010 because I noticed that this annual report that would come out, we weren't seeing any variation in the occupancy. I mean, our range over a 10-year period, our range was from like 47 to 50%. But we're seeing double-digit growth in tourism, but the average annual occupancy on the report isn't changing. And I thought, there's something wrong here. My wife and I have a property management background as well. My wife is a CPM, a certified property manager. She managed 5,000 units when we lived in Colorado. And she has more management experience than anybody in the country of Belize. I have more real estate investment experience. And we sat down and we're looking at this and trying to figure it out. And all of a sudden it hit us. It was how the Belize Tourism Board was calculating. They had the wrong numerator and denominator in the equation. So I went to the director of the Belize Tourism Board and I said, hey, you guys got to change this. You're doing it all wrong. If there's 46 units in the rental pool and 46 units are rented, that's 100% occupancy. You guys are reporting a 49.8% annual occupancy, but you're calculating it all wrong. Right now, we're running above 90% occupancy, but we're not showing anything above 50% on the actual reports that come out. And so, consequently, all of the hotel brands up until now have said, yep, the market hasn't matured. The official government statistics say so. And when I went to the director of the Belize Tourism Board, here's what his response was. Well, John, what would you have us do? We literally have 2 or 3 people in the department who do this reporting, who do these monthly calculations. Would you expect us to call every condo and resort and hotel? When would you have us call? Once a month? Once a week? Every day? Because literally, every owner that owns a property, that unit could be entering or coming out of the rental pool based on whether the owner is staying in it, or if he has friends staying in it, or if it's an owner-occupied unit that gets sold and becomes a rental, or a rental that gets sold and becomes owner-occupied. So the director of the Belize Tourism Board says, how often would you have us be calling and finding out? He said, we only have time to do it once a year. Once a year, we collect the hotel tax license. The operator pays to renew their license. And when they renew it, they ask the question, how many units do you have? Not how many are in the rental pool, just how many units do you have? And every year they put down the number, and for the entire year, that's the denominator. And they take however many slips of paper there are divided by that number that was provided one time. And I said to the director of the Belize Tourism Board, I said, do you have any idea how this would change tourism for the country if this was reported accurately? And his exact answer was, we haven't received a single complaint from any other hotel or resort or any operators. You're the only person who seems to have issue with it. And I said, well, of course. The existing hoteliers, do you think that they're bothered by this? Every single resort, condo development, and hotel on the island, the owner is doubling down and building more rooms or a second property. They know what's going on. When you go online and you try to book, when just this alone, the fact that the airlines are adding 1,600 additional seats per week, at some point the VP of Marriott is going to say, you know what, we can't trust this report. We're going to have to go down there and spend boots on the ground, hire an independent study. We're going to have to go down and see for ourselves. There's no way that the airlines could be adding 1,600 seats a week in a market that doesn't show above a 50% occupancy. Physically impossible. But here's the difference. Where do the hotels get their information? The Belize Tourism Board. Where do the airlines get their information? Their own internal booking system. They know their numbers are real. They know that those seats are full on the plane. And the problem is that because we haven't had the hotels and the brands and the flags come into the market and build, we're seriously behind on our inventory. And to this day, I have the largest brokerage in the country, and we still don't have a Marriott, a Hyatt, a Hilton, a Sheraton, any one of those even breaking ground or even starting on the first hotel in the #1 tourism island in the world. That's insider trading, and that's an incredible opportunity to take advantage of. Now, the second question is one that somebody likely would have asked fairly quickly, and that is, what about hurricanes and tropical storms? Is that a fair question? Anyone want that one answered? Yep. So I assure you that with a wife and 3 young kids, my parents and my wife's parents, absolutely positively, that was the first question they wanted answered before we moved, is have you thought about, have you researched, have you done your homework? And the answer was yes, I did a tremendous amount of homework. So let me explain. First of all, Belize does have hurricanes and tropical storms, very infrequently compared to the rest of the Caribbean because we're so far down in the southwest corner, but about every 40 years we have a major hurricane. Our last major hurricane was in 2000, 14 years ago. It was a Category 4 hurricane and it stalled over the island for 3 entire days. We had just a deluge. And what's important to understand about hurricane damage is that there's 2 types of damage. There's the wind damage and the storm surge. The wind damage you can primarily mitigate using modern building methodology, using hurricane straps, hurricane clips, tying the roof to the walls, to the foundation. When we think of wind damage from a hurricane, most of us don't realize that most wind damage is not caused by the hurricane itself, it's caused by tornadoes that are spawned by the hurricane. Last year, worldwide, there were 1,200 tornadoes. The United States had more than 1,100 of those tornadoes. The U.S. has more than 90% of all the tornadoes that occur worldwide. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 in Homestead, Florida, did tremendous wind damage, but it was the tornadoes that were spawned by the hurricane that tore down all the houses, because you can't build to protect from a tornado, but you can build to protect from a hurricane. So our development is built to withstand Category 4 storm force winds. I'll talk to you in a moment about insurance, because ultimately insurance is probably the most important aspect of the whole hurricane equation to begin with. But storm surge is where most of the damage comes from. We think of Hurricane Sandy, we think of Hurricane Katrina, and storm surge is where the vast majority of damage comes from. What is necessary for storm surge? A long distance of shallow water. If you look at Katrina, for example, with New Orleans, of course it doesn't help that New Orleans was 9 feet below sea level, but even aside from that, there were literally a couple hundred miles of shallow ocean water that allowed the storm surge to build up, because the shallow water causes a bigger storm surge. I spent 2 summers working on an oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico during college. We were 200 miles offshore and the water was 600 feet deep. That's pretty shallow to be 200 miles offshore. And so a storm surge with shallow water, Katrina had a 30-foot storm surge, but that same storm, if it had hit other parts of the eastern seaboard of the United States, would have been a 6 to 8 foot storm surge. That's how big a difference it makes if there's shallow water. When I showed you the aerial photo, the deepest water in all of the Caribbean is directly in front of Ambergris Key. Deep water is the polar opposite of what is required for storm surge. In fact, it dilutes or minimizes storm surge. And ultimately, the best protection you can have is to build a half-mile thick wall of rock that's a half-mile high and have it bear the brunt of the storm surge. And that's exactly what Ambergris Key does, is protect the island. Or, I'm sorry, the barrier reef. That's what it does, is protect the island. In 2005, shortly after Katrina, there was a more powerful hurricane called Wilma. It was a Category 5, the most powerful, and it made direct impact on Cancun and Cozumel, far north of Belize. But it passed offshore of Belize as a Category 5 hurricane, and on the barrier reef we had 18 to 20 foot waves. So you can imagine how big those waves were. But on the beach, I was standing on the beach taking photos of the 18 to 20 foot waves just a quarter mile away, but the waves on the beach were 2 feet high. And those are the only waves that I've seen in 9 years, were the 2 foot waves. The highest recorded water level in the last 150 years on Ambergris Key is 4 feet above sea level. That's the highest recorded water level during a storm surge from a hurricane or a tropical storm. All of our construction starts 6 feet above sea level. So it's important to understand the dynamics. The 2 other issues with hurricanes and tropical storms are that we have the benefit of Ambergris Key having the mainland of Belize effectively as our backyard. So for tourists, they don't have to worry about evacuating back to the United States. They can evacuate to the mainland and find shelter on the mainland. Most of the Caribbean, if people are there during a hurricane, they have to stay in a hurricane shelter. They have no way to flee the storm. If you're in Jamaica, if you're in Grand Cayman, other parts of the Caribbean, other islands in the Caribbean, the only way to get off those islands are the same jumbo jets that brought you there, and American and Delta and United and the other carriers quit flying new planes in advance of a hurricane. So there's no planes to take people out, and consequently you have to ride it out in a hurricane shelter. But in Belize, Tropic Air mobilizes their entire fleet of 16 planes, and if there's an evacuation, they can evacuate the entire island in about 4 hours' time. Everybody can go safely to the mainland, go to western Belize, wait out the storm, and then safely go back to the island. So It was a very important consideration for me. As a real estate investor, though, the thing that really comforts me is the insurance. Insurance in Belize, much like our taxes, is very simple. In Belize, when you get property insurance, it is called all perils insurance. What does it cover? All perils. There are no riders, disclaimers, small print, fine print. It doesn't say that if your toilet backs up that's not protected during flood conditions because it didn't come in the door, it came out of the toilet. There's nothing like that. It's just simple all perils insurance. So when you see in the executive summary, the line item for insurance covers the cost of all perils insurance on these units. There's only one option when you purchase insurance in Belize, and that option is also what we're using here in Mahogany Bay Village, and that's loss of rental income. That's the only option that you can add to your insurance policy, is to say that if, for example, there is damage, we've got to replace a roof, or there's other storm damage, if we're not going to be able to rent out those units for a period of time, say 2 months or 3 months while the repairs are being made, then the insurance policy not only covers the repairs, but it replaces the loss of rental income to ensure that the investors still have their stream of income. The distributions are made quarterly on the syndication, and so those quarterly distributions go out to each of the members based on their percentage interest in the syndication. So those are probably the two most important questions to answer. I know that we're a little over time, so I don't know, Dave, if you want me to open it up to a couple questions, or if you want to have people contact you offline, what would you prefer?
Let's take a couple.
Okay, so and just if anyone does need to leave, then I certainly understand and appreciate it very much. I'll just start by saying that thank you very, very much for allowing me the privilege of coming here. I'm passionate about Belize and sharing it with others, and I appreciate the opportunity to do so. So if you have to leave, I certainly understand. But I will go ahead and field any and all questions. So any questions you have about either the project, about investing, about IRA, what have you, I'll be happy to field them as best I can. Any question? Yes, sir.
What does it cost for insurance?
Okay, so the question was, what does it cost for insurance? So for example, on the keeping suites, and I use them only because I know the number off the top of my head, the keeping suites is a fourplex, and so the total annual insurance for all perils insurance is $11,000. That also includes contents as well, in addition to loss of rental income. So it's $11,000 for all 4 units together. So that works out to be $2,700, give or take, per unit on an annual basis. Property taxes, just to give you a context as well, that same lot of the same fourplex has property taxes of about $1,200 per year, about $300 per door, annual property taxes. So property taxes are very, very reasonable. Any other? And I'll repeat the questions back because I know not everybody can hear without the microphone. Yes, sir. Okay, so the question was, when are returns projected to start? So with rental operations commencing September of 2015, our first full quarter will be the 4th quarter of 2015. So the first quarter of the following year, the first quarter of 2016 is when the first distributions will be made, because they'll be made at the end of the quarter. So, good question. Any additional questions? I think I've just worn everybody out. Now, Murphy's Law is that about 5 minutes down the road, you'll think of a question. So if you can think of it now. Yes?
So the disbursements will be to the U.S. Bank or not the Belize Bank?
Okay, good question. So the question was, well, how will the disbursements be made? So first of all, just to explain, the LLC, the syndication is a Wyoming LLC, so you're actually becoming a member of the LLC. And so the distributions from the hotel company, from Scout Hotels, will be made directly to the LLC, and then the LLC will make a proportionate distribution to the individual investors based on what your level of investment is. And it doesn't have to be a U.S. bank. I mean, if you had wherever your banking instructions are is where the distributions will be made, but if it's a U.S. account, then it would certainly be made to a U.S. account. From a tax standpoint, I should mention as well, there is a depreciation with foreign investment property. You're able to do a 40-year straight line depreciation, so there is about an additional 2.5% that you get from depreciation on the property. Aside from that, the rental income in Belize is taxed at 1.75%, and so your 2.5% depreciation is going to more than offset what your Belize tax obligation is, but then it's going to be treated as ordinary income in the United States when it's repatriated back to you. So unfortunately, as U.S. citizens, we're one of only 2 countries in the world that taxes us on our global income, and so there's just no way around it. If somebody has an active business, if they own multiple properties and actively manage them and have full-time employees, if you qualify as an active business, then there is a tax deferral strategy that you can utilize, but you really have to be looking at a significantly larger investment to really make that worth the additional cost of setting up the entities properly and so forth. The one other thing I'll mention is that for those of you familiar with 1031 exchanges, you cannot do a 1031 exchange from the U.S. to Belize or from the U.S. to any other foreign country. But once you own a property outside of the U.S., you can do a 1031 exchange from one foreign property to another, from one foreign country to another. It doesn't even have to be within the same country. That wouldn't apply with a syndication because you're purchasing a security or a partial interest, but if you do own a property outright, and again, this is just purely for educational purposes, so just so that you understand that you can do 1031s from non-U.S. to non-U.S. property. It has to be a like-kind exchange. Okay. Well, on that basis, I just want to say once again, thank you very much. I appreciate your allowing me to be here. If you have any additional questions, or if you have any questions in private, Dave and myself will both be around for a little bit here afterwards. And Dave, thanks so much for putting this together, and thank all of you for coming. Sincerely appreciate it, and have a safe drive home.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, just a couple points. One thing I wanted to point out, on the personal use component, if you invest $150,000, you get to use the garden cottage once a year. That's only non-IRA funds. So if you use your IRA, you can use the buildings. The other thing, couple things just to highlight, couple things that I like about this project. Some of you guys invest in your business. 11 to 13% return might not be real attractive to you, but the one thing that I wanted to point back to was we're basing that on a 72% occupancy, and that's on an island that is averaging a 90% occupancy. 3 to 5 years, our goal would be to get you your investment capital back in within 3 to 5 years using leverage. So just a couple points like that. Last time John was here, we had a successful turnout, and we funded within a few days after the event. So would love to have some of you guys, a bunch of you guys, join us in this investment. We'll be around here to talk, and feel free to mingle and chat with us very shortly here. Thank you.
It seems that every time I